We went in his Snapchat. There was absolutely nothing. No saved videos. And even my sister was like, yeah, that's suspicious.
A phone is supposed to prove where someone was. This one proves nothing, because everything on it is gone, not deleted by accident. Gone. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why that terrifies his mother more than anything else in this case. Somebody hands you a phone that belonged to your son. You know that phone. You know it better than almost anything else about him, because it's how you talk to him every single day. And when you open it, there's nothing there, nothing important. Nothing at all. No selfies, no videos. No silly photo with a peace sign thrown up, the kind he sent you without even thinking about it. The kind that made you smile before you even knew what he was doing that day. Just an empty phone, handed back to you like it's supposed to explain something, when all it does is raise the one question nobody in this case has been able to answer yet. Where did everything go? That's the question sitting underneath every version of what happened to Nolan Wells. Not who he was talking to, not whether he got back on the boat. All of that matters, and we're going to walk through every piece of it. But underneath all of it is a phone that should have been full and came back blank, and a family that doesn't believe that happened by accident. We're not going to tell you what we think happened on that island. We're going to show you exactly what's been said, by who, and where it stops lining up. By the end, you'll understand why Nolan's own parents, sitting side by side with their attorney, used the same 3 words to describe this case. None of this adds up. Before we go any further, what do you think happened to that phone? Drop your theory in the comments. We're going to walk through every version of this story, and I want to see if your gut is right by the end. Before any of this, Nolan Xavier Wells was 18 years old and, by every account given so far, the kind of kid other kids naturally organized themselves around. Not because he was loud about it. His father has described him as a quiet leader, someone whose actions did the talking, on the football field and on the basketball court, while other kids simply followed without needing to be told to. He was a student athlete at Southwest Mississippi Community College, juggling football and school the way a lot of 18-year-olds do, which is to say, not always gracefully, but seriously. He had a Division I tryout scheduled for the Monday, right after this holiday weekend. A real opportunity, sitting right there in front of him, 4 days away. And then there was the phone. According to his mother, Christine, Nolan practically lived on Snapchat. Not in a way that worried her, in the ordinary low-stakes way most parents of teenagers would recognize. He sent her selfies constantly. A peace sign here, a goofy face there. Just to check in. Just because that's what his thumbs did without him thinking about it. It was such a routine part of how they communicated that she's described it almost like a running joke between them. His hand practically attached to that phone. Hold on to that detail. It's going to matter more than it sounds like it should right now. This was supposed to be a low-stakes weekend for Nolan. A group of friends, a boat, a holiday. His father has called it something close to a last stretch of freedom before real life. Football, school, that tryout, came back into focus. Nothing about the setup suggested there was anything to worry about, which is exactly why what happened next doesn't sit right with either of his parents. The trip itself started the way it always had. According to Christine, this exact group of boys had made this exact trip to Horn Island before, without incident. They stayed together the night before, launched the boat that morning of the 4th of July, and by all accounts, nothing about the early part of the day looked any different from any other summer outing. Nolan didn't give his mother a firm time he'd be back. She wasn't expecting one. That, on its own, wasn't unusual. There had been other nights when he stayed out later than planned, caught up with friends, lost track of time the way teenagers do. Nobody was watching the clock with any particular concern. Somewhere on that island, in the hours after 3 in the afternoon, something happened that neither of his parents has been able to get a straight account of since. What we know is this. At some point that day, Nolan was reportedly talking with a young woman on the island, a detail that, depending on who's telling it, means two very different things. According to one version relayed to Christine early on, Nolan chose to stay behind with this young woman rather than return to the boat with his friends. According to a very different version, one that surfaced later, from the young woman herself, Nolan told her the opposite, that he was heading back to rejoin the group. Two accounts of the same conversation. They cannot both be true. And somewhere in that same window, there's a video that's circulated widely online, audio reportedly, of some kind of argument taking place on or near the island. A voice, that some believe is Nolan's, can be heard saying something close to, "Where's my phone? What are you doing?" Attorney Ben Crump has described that audio with more certainty in some interviews than others, but the underlying claim hasn't changed across any version he's given. There was an argument that day involving Nolan, and it was reportedly about that same phone. By evening, Nolan wasn't on the boat, and the sequence of events that followed is where his parents say the story stops making sense. Christine wasn't alarmed right away. Evenings had gone long before. Nolan had stayed out past expected times, caught up with friends, lost track of the clock. None of it unusual on its own. Then, at 11:07 that night, her phone rang, and the second she saw it wasn't Nolan calling. It was one of the boys from the boat, calling her directly. Something in her dropped. She said, plainly, that Nolan's friends simply don't call her like that, not for anything ordinary. The caller was Warren. According to attorney Ben Crump, Warren also claimed he'd contacted the Coast Guard that night, though Crump has since said there are what he's called discrepancies around that specific claim. From there, things moved, but not in a straight line. Christine called a family friend, Toshima, whose own sons had grown up alongside Nolan since their City League days. She asked her to check with the boys directly. Meanwhile, the group of boys started trying to locate Nolan through Snapchat's location feature, since they all followed each other there. Christine, separately, was checking Life 360, a different tracking app entirely, and that's when the first real mismatch showed up. Nolan's phone was showing up in one location. His car was showing up somewhere else entirely. Two devices, two different places. Already, before a single official had been contacted, the story had started to split. What happened next is the part of this case that's easy to skip past, because none of it is dramatic. It's paperwork. It's phone trees. But it's also, according to more than one legal analyst who's since reviewed this case, exactly the kind of gap where evidence tends to disappear. Christine and Elmore turned their attention to notifying authorities and immediately found themselves bounced between agencies: the Sheriff's Department, the City of Ocean Springs, the Department of Marine Resources, who took her information and then redirected her right back to Ocean Springs Police. Eventually, Jackson County stepped in and took the case over entirely. I want to slow down on this part, because I think it matters more than it sounds like it should. This is a family living through the worst night of their lives, and instead of anyone actively searching, they're spending those early hours simply trying to figure out who's even supposed to be in charge. Sheriff's Department, City Police, a state resources agency, each one pointing them somewhere else. And by the time Jackson County formally took the case, hours had already passed since that first call came in at 11:07. Meanwhile, that phone, the one that was already showing up in a location that didn't match Nolan's car, still hadn't made it back to his family. Toshima had told Christine not to worry about retrieving it herself, that she'd handle it. But by Christine's own account, it took a while before it actually reached her hands. And even after that, the handoff itself required more coordinating. First for the phone, then again later for Nolan's car, still parked at the house where the group had stayed the night before the trip. Every one of those hours is time an analyst reviewing this case has since pointed to directly. If a phone changes hands multiple times before it reaches the people it belongs to, and something is deleted from it during that window, that gap alone, regardless of what turns out to be on the phone, is the kind of thing that raises chain of custody questions in any real investigation. There's still a lot we don't have answers to. The toxicology results, whether those deleted messages get recovered. What happens when Nolan's friends are finally questioned directly? If you want to be here when that happens, subscribe now, because we're not walking away from this one. Here is the version of events that was first given to Nolan's family, laid out plainly and without any spin. Nolan chose, on his own, to stay behind on the island. He wanted more time with the young woman he'd been talking to, reportedly named Katie, and planned to catch a ride back later with a different group of friends already on the island that day. Taken on its own, that's not an unreasonable story. 18-year-olds make exactly this kind of decision all the time. A friend group splits up for an hour. Someone stays behind talking to someone they just met, and it works itself out later that night over pizza and an argument about whose fault it was that everyone had to wait around. Christine's response to that story was immediate. No. She said Nolan was raised on one specific rule. If you leave with the group, you come back with the group. Full stop. If she'd been in that situation, she says she would have told him to get back on the boat, and if he pushed back, she would have handed him a phone right there to call his own parents so they could tell him the same thing. In her words, at no time would she have left someone else's child behind, especially on an island. Elmore's account lines up with hers almost word for word, but through a different lens, years of conversations he'd had directly with his son. He's described constantly telling Nolan not to split off from the group chasing after a girl. There are girls everywhere, he'd tell him. She's not the only one. He figures Nolan probably got tired of hearing it, but that's exactly why, in his mind, none of this adds up. If 3 friends leave and one stays behind, the other 3 make sure that one person has what he needs: his phone, his bag, even if there's friction over it in the moment. You don't leave somebody behind on an island without their phone. His closing line on the subject has stayed the same across every interview he's given. He does not believe his son volunteered to stay on that island. He says he simply cannot believe that. So now you have 2 completely different Nolans. One who made a spontaneous, low-stakes decision to stay behind with a girl, and one who, according to the 2 people who knew him best, would never have agreed to be separated from his group, let alone without his phone. This is where the story stops holding together, one piece at a time. Start with Katie herself. According to Christine, the very first explanation she was given, that Nolan stayed behind for a young woman named Katie, came packaged with something strange. In that same initial conversation, she was also told that Katie herself was missing, and that nobody in the group actually knew who she was. Sit with that. The entire explanation for why Nolan didn't get on the boat depends on a specific person. And in the first version of this story his own mother ever heard, that same person was described as unaccounted for and unknown. Then there's the direct contradiction Crump has pointed to from later reporting. The young woman Nolan was reportedly with has said Nolan told her he was heading back to rejoin his friends. The friends on the boat say the opposite, that Nolan told them he wanted to stay behind with her. Crump's response has been blunt. Which is it? Somebody isn't telling the truth. Then there's the argument. The circulating video, the audio some believe captures Nolan's own voice, demanding to know where his phone went and what was being done with it. If that's accurate, then at some point that day, there was a confirmed dispute over that exact device. The same device that later came back to his family completely wiped. Then there's the phone itself. And this is where the detail we planted earlier comes back around. Nolan didn't casually use Snapchat. By his mother's account, it was constant. Selfies, peace signs, check-ins, without her even having to ask. When she and her sister went through his phone after it was finally returned, they found nothing. No saved photos. No saved videos. Not from that day. Not from anything. His sister checked the secondary account too. Also empty. Here's why the timing on this matters. Snapchat content of that kind typically disappears automatically after 24 hours, if nobody saves it. Christine and her sister started searching Nolan's phone before that window had even closed. Which means if there had been anything there, anything at all from an entire day at the beach with a group of friends, it should still have been recoverable. It wasn't. One legal analyst who's reviewed cases like this has made a point worth repeating here. Deleting something from a phone doesn't actually erase it in most cases. It gets hidden at different levels of the device, and a proper forensic examination can often still reach it. That analyst has personally helped build a murder case around deleted text messages before, which is exactly why Nolan's family is now working with experts, trying to recover both the Snapchat content and any deleted text messages. Because if the data is really gone, someone made sure of it. Then there's a detail that has nothing to do with anyone's memory or interpretation of a stressful night. A photograph. After Christine posted publicly asking for information, a young woman who'd been on the island that day reached out. She told Christine that the official report described Nolan wearing black shorts. According to photos this young woman took that same day, Nolan was wearing blue. Black and blue are not colors you mix up, in person or in a photo. This isn't somebody misremembering a chaotic night. It's a documented photograph directly contradicting an official description of a simple, verifiable fact. Stack all of it together. The Katie contradiction. The reversed accounts of Nolan's last conversation, the recorded argument over the phone, the impossibly empty Snapchat account, the shorts that don't match the report. And you start to understand why a panel of legal analysts reviewing this case had a consistent read on it. One analyst raised the obvious legal question directly. If there was a recorded argument over that phone, and the friends left the island with it while Nolan did not return with them, that arguably constitutes theft, and law enforcement has tools, like exigent warrants, to compel phone carriers and apps to hand over data quickly in exactly this kind of situation. She questioned why none of that appears to have happened in the first several days. Multiple analysts also pushed back on something else. The fact that the sheriff's office said, this early, that they saw no evidence of foul play, even while the investigation was reportedly ongoing. Their point wasn't that foul play is confirmed. Their point was that an active investigation this early has no business closing a door before the basic questions, the ones sitting in this exact list, have even been answered, and there's still the swimming question sitting underneath all of it. Nolan was a college athlete, in excellent shape, by every account a strong swimmer. Being a strong swimmer doesn't rule out drowning. Rip currents and exhaustion can overwhelm anyone, and searchers, including members of the United Cajun Navy, have pointed to a real rip current in that area that day. But Crump's underlying question isn't really about swimming. It's about the fact that this happened in a crowded public place, on a major holiday, surrounded by boats and people, and nobody has come forward saying they saw Nolan in visible distress in the water. This case has pulled in outside support most families never see. Colin Kaepernick helped fund an independent autopsy. Tyler Perry is covering funeral costs. Reverend Al Sharpton has appeared publicly alongside the family. And Crump, explaining why the family sought an investigation separate from the state, has directly invoked Mississippi's own history, referencing Emmett Till in the same state as part of why a black family watching a mostly white friend group's account be treated as settled fact makes them uneasy. Christine has addressed that racial layer of this case directly, and it's worth including in full. Some of the public reaction has focused on the fact that Nolan's friend group was mostly white, and questioned, in ugly terms, why he was even in it. Her answer has been unambiguous. She and her husband never told their children who they were allowed to be friends with based on skin color, and she said Nolan was capable of being close with anybody, a trait she credits directly to how she and Elmore raised him. If someone has a problem with that, she's said, that's their problem, not hers. What matters here is that neither parent is interested in relitigating who Nolan's friends were. Their focus, consistently, across every interview, is on what actually happened during the hours he went missing. Crump has also acknowledged something that matters for how far this investigation can actually go right now. He hasn't personally spoken with the young men who were with Nolan that day, because they've since retained their own legal representation. Which means, at this stage, there's been no direct conversation between the family's legal team and the people who were physically there. Everything that's emerged from that group so far has come secondhand. Officially, the state medical examiner has completed an autopsy, though full results including toxicology are still pending. Investigators have said they suspect Nolan drowned, but that has not been confirmed as an official finding. Jackson County Sheriff John Ledbetter has continued to say publicly that his office hasn't found evidence of a crime, while also acknowledging, in his own words, that people want answers faster than a real investigation can move. He said it will take real, hard work to get this right. Crump, for his part, has raised the question of whether the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation should take this case over entirely, rather than leaving it with the local sheriff's office. What we're left with is a mother and father who do not accept the explanation they were first given. A phone that came back to them with everything gone from it. Not just messages, but every trace of an ordinary day that should have been full of them, the way Nolan's phone always was. A documented photograph that contradicts the official description of what he was wearing. A video with audio that may or may not be confirmed as his own voice, capturing what sounds like an argument over that same device. And two directly conflicting accounts of the very last conversation he ever had. Nolan Wells was 18 years old, a football player, a son his father called a silent leader, the kind of kid other kids naturally followed. A young man his mother says would never have chosen to be left behind, alone, without his phone, without a word to anyone about when he'd be coming home. His parents aren't asking anyone to accept a theory. They're asking for a real investigation, and they're asking publicly because they say they haven't gotten straight answers any other way. There's one more thing worth sitting with here. It isn't rage. It isn't even primarily an accusation against any one person. It's something closer to disbelief, sitting on top of grief. Christine has talked about trying to protect her family, trying to protect her own peace, while strangers online treat her son's death like entertainment. Elmore has talked about a young man he spent years preparing for the world, gone in a way he still cannot make sense of. Neither of them has said definitively what they believe happened out on that island in the hours after 3 that afternoon. What they've said, consistently, across every interview, is that the story they were first given does not match the son they raised. And somewhere in all of it is still that phone, full, once, of a life, handed back empty. If you've got a kid of your own, a phone that's supposed to be full of them, a group they leave the house with. This story probably sat with you differently than most. That's exactly why it's worth doing 3 things right now. Drop your take in the comments on what you think that phone is hiding. Hit subscribe so you're here for whatever comes next in this case, and send this to one person who'd want to know. Not for the algorithm, for Nolan, and for a family still waiting on a straight answer.